In AP Research, each of the assessment tasks focuses on a set of proficiencies or groups of learning objectives that students should be able to demonstrate. The ones circled here in green are those that the academic paper addresses, and the ones circled in orange are addressed via the presentation or oral defense. With the color-coded circles, you can now see how each component of the performance assessment task addresses some similar proficiencies as well as unique ones. There are 7 rows in the presentation and oral defense rubric. You can see in the first column the content area or course proficiency that each row is linked to, which is the primary focus for that row. In each row, except for rows 5 through 7, there are 3 levels of performance on the scale, and you could assume these levels are low, medium, high. Each level of performance comes with a description of what typically you see in student work at that level of performance for that proficiency. In rows 5, 6, and 7, you can assume the 2 levels here are not proficient and proficient instead of low, medium, and high. So, just as before, you need to be looking for best fit. That is, you need to assign the score with the description that best fits the student's presentation or oral defense for any particular row of the rubric. However, there are times when the student's work may meet some components of the middle or high column, but does not meet or exceed all the components of the low column. So what do you do? For example, in row 3, a student may have explained how the steps in the research process led to the development of their conclusion, but what if the connections between their assumptions and final conclusions are simplistic? In this case, the student must receive the low score on the rubric for that row. How will you know to do this? Well, in order to ensure consistency and fairness with using the rubric, stick to the following rule. The student must meet or exceed the complete requirement in the first column before they can go on to the middle column and so forth. Don't worry, I will give more detail and examples about this rule of thumb when we look at the rubric row by row in the next series of activities. Moving on with the general structure of the rubric, different rows have different point values allocated to them in order to differentiate between their weighting, or in other words, their relative importance to the task. When assigning points, make sure you look at what row you're on and the points that are available for you to assign. You can see here that row 1 is worth 1, 2, or 3 points, and row 4, for example, is worth 2, 4, or 6 points. Just as a reminder, if a row is worth 2, 4, or 6, you cannot assign middle of the road like 3, 5, 7 points. You have to choose what is available for you in the rubric. Remember to look at the overall performance of the student in that row, and remember our rule from above about crossing from one column to another. Finally, 0 scores can be given in cases where the work doesn't meet the performance level described in the lowest column. And details and examples about 0 scores will be provided as we discuss each row of the rubric. Take a few minutes to download and review the presentation and oral defense rubric. You may find it helpful to print out the rubric so that you can have it handy for the rest of this module. Now that you've reviewed the rubric, try to describe in very few words what you think each row is looking for. And though there are many ways to describe each row, one way you could summarize the entire rubric is to think about it in terms of 3 parts. For the first 3 rows, you're concerned about the quality of what students are saying, regardless of how they're saying it. That's their inquiry journey, their new understanding, and how they came to that new understanding or conclusion. In row 4, it's about how they are communicating their argument, how clearly and convincingly they are getting their message across to the audience. The last 3 rows are about how well the students can defend the choices they made during their inquiry process, and just how well they came to their new understanding or conclusion through that process. Note that each row looks at something different, so it is possible that students may score highly on one part of the rubric and less well on other parts. You will sometimes see examples of weak content presented well, and strong content not presented well. It's important that you keep this in mind when scoring, so the quality of the presenting doesn't get confused with the quality of the content. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to watch 3 student samples, and of course throughout the module you'll be viewing a few more. When you're watching these presentations, please try to remember these general rules. First, do not be tempted to watch the presentation repeatedly. Part of the skill of presenting is to convey information clearly, so if you have to go through the presentation multiple times to look for something, it was probably not made sufficiently clear. You should only go back if you were conscious that you tuned out or were interrupted for some reason, or if you need to confirm a particular score. But on that note, make sure you watch the video in its entirety. You never know where evidence for a particular row will emerge. Second, the presentation encompasses rows 1 through 4, and the oral defense covers rows 5 through 7, and never the two shall mix. What I mean by that is, the answers from the oral defense questions shall not be used as evidence to score rows 1 through 4, and evidence from the presentation cannot be used to score rows 5 through 7. Next, pay attention to the conjunctions, verbs, and qualifiers in the rows of the rubric. There are and or situations, as well as situations where stating something earns very different points than describing something in detail. Further, the quality of what is being said is important too, like oversimplified versus compelling. Do not infer. If the student did not say it or show it on their slides, it is not there. Do not count the frequency of things. It's more important to get a general sense of the quality of a requirement than to count how many times that requirement occurred. And finally, the presentation and oral defense must meet or exceed all the components required in the first column of a row before it can move over to the next column, and so on. With reference to the timestamps and the annotated scores for the videos, due to differing buffering speeds and programs for running videos, the timestamps that are referred to in the annotated scores may be off by 5 to 10 seconds. Use the timestamp provided to get a general sense of where the evidence is located in the student sample. In reference to oral defense questions, in some of the videos, some of the students are asked more than one question for each category. I guess this is due to extra time that the students had or a misunderstanding by the oral defense panelist that was too late to fix. In future, students are to be asked no more than 3 to 4 questions, with at least one question coming from each of the 3 categories in the course and exam description. As far as the annotated scores for these videos, the scores are earned from the first question asked from one of the categories, and all other additional questions from the same category were ignored. Also, you may notice that questions aren't asked in the order that the category appears in the rubric. This is fine. There's no law against the order by which the oral defense questions may be asked. However, to aid you in scoring your student work, you might want to consider asking or having your panelists ask the chosen questions in the order that they appear on the rubric. Again, not a requirement, just a suggested strategy for efficiency of scoring. And finally, even though you would stop scoring your student after the 20-minute window was up in your own classroom, some of these samples are longer due to recording issues, interruptions of the PA system, or even teachers allowing students to perform a 20-minute presentation, but then allowing the oral defense portion of the presentation to go beyond that. Because we needed to use some of these longer samples, please don't adjust scores based on timing for such samples. On that note, let me remind everyone, the entire presentation and oral defense should take no more than 15 to 20 minutes total. You may teach your students to plan their time however you wish. Just make sure there is time for their presentation and time for 3 to 4 oral defense questions within the 15 to 20 minute time frame. I don't want to make a recommendation about time here because I want you to figure out what works best for your students in your classroom. As far as being fair, I would have a timekeeper in my room. I would let students know when there were 5 minutes remaining, and then I would tell them in advance that when the 20-minute mark had been reached, I'm going to ask them to finish their last sentence, and then the presentation or oral defense is over. This is a fair and equitable strategy. Just make sure students know what you will do before they prepare for this component of the AP Research Performance Assessment task. Now that we've reviewed the general structure of the rubric and some general rules in applying it, the next activity will help you see the details for each of the 7 rows of the presentation oral defense rubric. The rubric's achievement levels will be illustrated in light of 3 student samples. Please take time to view these 3 samples before working through the next activity.